There's so many barriers to the subjective human experience. And, when we talk about the spirit being divine, being eternal, and being, vast, that's not something that could be measured. That's not something that could be, that could be scientifically validated. And unfortunately, that's kind of like, I'm sure you can understand that's where we kind of lose out. And
I think we
human experience at the same time.
Well, I think we lose out because we can't leave the scientific methodology, and the way of the rational mind has one way of working in the world, and it's the measuring and collecting the data in a certain kind of way so that you can prove it to someone else, so that you can repeat it. You have to be able to repeat that experiment for it to be believed. Okay, that's good. That's the rational, conceptual mind. But there is the symbolic mind. If someone wants to call an experience God or the tree or a river, that's their business. But it doesn't matter what they call it. It's what did they experience? And this is purely personal, purely subjective. But we can say certain things about them. And you did even with the statistics, is that it was meaningful to them. It had an effect on the way they lived their lives. They were happier, probably. They were able to live a creative life. In the long term. And, we've had such a hard time with that in the West because, once again, this is part of our suppression, is that we have only valued the rational conceptual brain, that component, brain component. That's the only thing. It was superior to all other aspects of the brain. That's Western thinking. And so all of the other components were just left to atrophy. For instance, the symbolic brain, we threw away dreams or visions. It's a hallucination. It's an illness because we were so ignorant. And yet, here is the symbolic brain. Jean-Baptiste Vico was one of the first really major theorists of symbolic language. And he understood, even in the 1700s, that the symbolic brain has its own language. It has a poetic logic. We've said in the West, it's just silly. It just has no logic whatsoever because we were ignorant. We never paid enough attention to it to see that it has a poetic logic. In fact, it is that poetic logic that is given to the left brain. Otherwise, the left brain would not know what logic is. And he says that we really must allow both of these brain components equal value, and that there should be always a continuum, a dynamic continuum of movement between the symbolic and the conceptual, that gives a wholeness to the mind. We've not done that. We still don't do that. And so when someone has experienced something, that's the symbolic mind. And that needs to then flow into the conceptual mind. The conceptual mind will try to understand it in the way that it can, but then it needs to flow back into the symbolic, because the symbolic embodies all aspects of the experience. And that's what makes us human. That which makes us able to love and to live and to relate. It can't be quantified in the way the conceptual mind wants to, but there's something else still. Never mind all of the other brain components from the spine all the way through the mammalian brains and the frontal cortex. There's also the heart. We never knew in our ignorance that the heart is a brain component. So that now today with heart math is I don't know if you know that, but it's a great thing to look into. Heart math, they are able to really work with the heart. In fact, they have worked with young people who've been having maybe trouble with aggressiveness or violence or not doing well in school. When they work and train this people how to activate, allow the heart to be activated and flow through all of these brain components and through the heart, they realize the aggression goes away. They do better in school, but they also know that the heart gives more frequencies to the brain than the brain gives to the heart. It is the central brain component. And in our ignorance, so that when we talk about scientific, that's a part of the conceptual brain. We need to bring into equal status the symbolic, which actually is more in touch with that vast consciousness. It comes through and always speaks in symbolic language. So we have these two brain components always flowing through the heart, which is love, which is meaning, which has a huge portal to the universe. We haven't even known that. The ancestors knew that it was through the heart. And when that energy starts flowing, then we don't have this need to, I got to have a figure for this. I've got to have some outside proof, because you do know it. You absolutely know it. And that's what gnosis means in Western thinking, is that's that deep knowing that comes from experience. Then we can go over to the conceptual brain and see what it can do with it. But it always has to check back with the symbolic. But it has to flow through the heart, because that's when you have that absolute knowing.
Wow. Now, I mean, it makes so much sense. So there's this big principle in ethology, right? Ethology is the study of animals, where you must see the animal that you're studying, let's say a mouse, and speak in its own language, right? The language that it gives you. Let's say you light up a part of the mouse's brain, and let's say we'll go with the sexual example, right? You light up a part of the human's brain and for sexual, and it gets goosebumps. But you light up a mouse's brain and it starts running around, and you're like, what the hell, right? What is it? And it really makes no sense, right? Why is it that they're doing two different, we'll say, activities for the same brain region? And the answer is very simple. They have different mating strategies, right? It makes obvious sense. And the same thing you could see with maternal strategies. So if you stimulate the human brain in one area, and this is for women, they go like this. They feel the need to hold something. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? And then you stimulate the same part of the brain in the mouse, and it starts running around and tearing up things. And you're like, what? Like, why is it doing that? And the answer is, for both of them, that's the maternal behavior that they need to experience. So for the rat, she's trying to protect her offspring, right? She's trying to scratch up everything. And for the mother, she's trying to nurture, right? And the human mother, she's nurturing. And the idea, which is so common in ethology, like this is the basic principles, that you need to speak in its own language. If you try to explain it in human terms, then it won't work. Why don't we do that for spirituality? Clearly, the emotions and the human are so much different than each other. And yes, like obviously they speak in a different language. You were talking about this before, and it's so clear, you were in a religious school and some people just believed it and some people understood it but didn't believe it. And the difference is because they're giving you the Bible in terms of words and logic and reasoning. They're not talking to you in terms of emotion. And that's exactly what Walt Whitman does. That's exactly what Henry David Thoreau does. They speak with emotion. They speak with poems. They speak with the language of, let's say, the spirit or the soul. And, well, the question is, why don't we do that? So the question is, if we still look at it from a scientific lens, if we're looking at it in terms of this rational scientific method, that's a different language from the language of the soul.
Well, and it's also fragmented, because we're looking, and that's been the history of the West, is that we only valued results from the left brain, from measuring and that kind of thing. That's a valuable method. But if we go to the symbolic language, which is equal to conceptual language, it's going to speak in terms of a symbol. And that symbol emerges out of the human psyche. I always like to remind myself that true images and myths are not something we just write and comes out of the left brain. Those images emerge out of the depths of the psyche. And so that image, that symbol, is going to carry meaning in many different ways. And the left brain can kind of try to work with it. We do. When I have a dream, I do work with it, with the left brain. But I always, in Vico sense, I go back to that. And then when you go back to that, you have to sort of step into what you're saying with Whitman and Thoreau and Emerson, is that you step into the wholeness of the symbol, which is the feeling. It's that experience of it. Without that, we do terrible things. If we just have the left brain, we can make images of lists of names of people who are going to be killed in the oven the next day.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what you see in prisons, right? So I had a
Exactly.
guy, his name was Doug Nolan, and one of the stats that he encountered when he was getting into helping prisoners and helping them become more social is that 90% of prisoners have some form of antisocial personality disorder, right? Some problem in terms of they're just not connected to people. They're not connected to the world. They're a little bit, repressed and distant from the world itself. And what he works on is emotional validation. He allows people to start to feel emotionally validated. And he turned one of the most dangerous dangerous female prisons in the country into one of the safest with that exact method.
That's the way our culture should work. What I'm hoping is that, with this kind of understanding, that kind of work can be done in a prison. I mean, that's brilliant and meaningful, is that we have a culture that separates everything and destroys all kinds of meaning and relatedness so that we can live our lives in that way. Because other cultures, I mean, if we should focus on trying to create a culture of that sort, so we do that kind of work in a prison instead of looking at it in a certain kind of negative way. And that if we created structures in our culture that validated and honored that wholeness that we can experience, then it would be easier for people to be born into the culture and find themselves. Right now, we have structures that do everything to separate us from everything that is essentially human. So I think that our work and the work of your generation will be that kind of work. How do we create a culture where it's easier to live meaningful, connected lives, and for that meaning to be valued more than its salability,